Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you to BAVS for inviting me to come and give one of these talks. As you've heard, I'm going to talk today about emotions and the Victorians. The emotions are troubling things. They churn and ooze in our bodies. They make us feel sweaty, nervous, anxious. Some of the worst as well as some of the best moments of every human life are characterized by these bodily eruptions and surgings within. And yet, emotions are also very intellectual things. Emotions are representations of the world. They are ideas, they are beliefs. So that dual nature of emotion is itself something that fascinates me. And then there's another level of emotional experience where we have feelings about our feelings, and we have thoughts about our feelings about our feelings. And amongst those complicated sets of ideas and feelings are our beliefs about the past. And the thing I want to suggest overall today is that our memory of the Victorians, our interaction with classic pieces of Victorian literature in particular, are amongst those ideas and beliefs that shape our emotional experiences still today. What we think and feel about what we think the Victorians felt changes what we feel about what we think we feel. And don't worry, it's going to get clearer as we go on. And another central idea in what I want to say is that we have, as we already heard from Holly Fenneau in her lecture today, we have this very conflicted dual inheritance when we do think and feel back into the Victorian era. On the one hand, there's this inheritance of restraint and repression of feeling, and on the other hand, this quite over-the-top sentimentality which leaks out in all sorts of ways. So I'm going to get at these questions today by talking about Dickens, Wilde, and the history of emotions, or how to cry like a Victorian. And whether or not you do end up, at the end of my talk, wanting to cry like a Victorian, you'll hopefully agree it's quite a good time to be asking these questions. I first got interested in this much longer history of weeping that I've written about through Victorian examples I came across, such as Sir James Shaw Wills, a weeping judge who shed tears into his notebook so that he had to stop speaking while pronouncing sentence of death over people who appeared before him. Here I thought was an interesting and confusing subject. And we live today in a new age of sensibility. Our own era is a tearful, emotional, and expressive one. So again, it seems like a good time to be asking, what makes good or bad crying? What do we think is sentimental? What do we think is true emotion? So let me start with the stoical end of the spectrum and Rudyard Kipling. You'll all be familiar with his extremely popular and famous poem, If, written in 1895, inspired by the daring, if illegal, and reckless actions of Leander Starr Jameson in the run-up to the Boer War. It's a very familiar litany of conditionals addressed from a father to his son. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, this resonates with all of us who work in academic departments, the time of exams and marking. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can dream and not make dreams your master. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. That final couplet I just read there is, as you probably know, engraved on the player's entrance to Centre Court at Wimbledon. It's put up there in 1923 and it's still there, inspiring tearful performances from Andy Murray and others. And the payoff of all this, what is it that is promised to this man, this ice man, who doesn't take either human or material benefit or disaster too hard? Yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. So this is the mantra of the imperial man, the man who's going to inherit the empire. We also have it on the authority of the greatest scientist of the Victorian age, Charles Darwin, that there was something special and especially unemotional about the English in the Victorian period. Darwin's 1872 study of the expression of the emotions in man and animals includes the statement that English men rarely cry. Unlike women, unlike infants, unlike the insane, and unlike foreigners of various kinds, Englishmen rarely cry. except under the pressure of the acutest grief. So here we see a scientific version of this image of the Victorian man. But of course, there's that other side of the Victorian inheritance too, the more sentimental side. And before I come on to Little Nell, I also wanted to point out that we probably have in our imaginations two corresponding images of Queen Victoria herself, which correspond to these two aspects of the emotional inheritance from her era. The forbidding empress, the grieving widow of the later Victorian period, as cheerless as she was tearless, unmoved and unmoving. But then, it was not always that way, and if we go back to 1837, at the very beginning of Victoria's reign, the teenage girl standing on the balcony of St James's Palace, age 18, when she was first proclaimed to her subjects. Victoria was greeted with cheers and shouts, gentlemen waving their hats, women waving their handkerchiefs. And overwhelmed by this show of devotion from her subjects, the young queen was reduced to tears. It was reported with much admiration in the press that the tears were flowing in torrents down her pallid cheeks. And these queenly tears were celebrated by the poet Elizabeth Barrett in a poem called The Young Queen, and another one called Victoria's Tears. So the Victorian age was baptized in tears and sentiment. And the most famous purveyor of such sentiment, of course, was Charles Dickens. And it's to his work that I and many other scholars who've become interested in emotion and sentiment in literature, as well as Victorian history more generally, have often turned as an obvious starting point, looking again at Victorian culture, this time with even more feeling. Dickens made a very good living out of tears. He became the most popular, the most successful, the most famous of Victorian authors. And when we think back to him, perhaps what we most often think about are his death scenes. He was very good at killing characters, especially killing children. We think of Nancy Sykes, we think of Sidney Carton. It's a far, far better thing. We think of Paul Dombey, and most of all about Little Nell Trent, these fatal moments in Dickens' fiction which brought bucketfuls of tears from his early readers and still do to this day. This was really gushing, extreme stuff. Dickens himself wept as he wrote these stories. Readers wept. Those who went to private or public readings by Dickens himself were very often moved to tears, as well as sometimes to laughter. And although Little Nell is the most famous of these deaths, I thought I'd talk just for a couple of minutes today instead about Paul Dombey. And many discerning Dickens fans at the time thought that in fact it was the death of Paul Dombey which was the peak of Dickensian pathos and the most moving scene of all. Paul Dombey, as you will recall, was a prematurely wise sort of man-child, this innocent, frail boy, out of place among other children, very philosophical. He's repeatedly called an old-fashioned boy by other characters in the book. And this little extract here comes from chapter 16, the final chapter, as far as Paul's concerned, entitled What the Waves Were Always Saying, where young Paul slowly fades away in his deathbed, gripped by this golden vision of light reflected from the river through his window onto the wall, creating a golden ripple as he fades away, and has a vision of his dead mother in heaven welcoming him with a golden glow around her. And he's accompanied on his final moments by his beloved sister Florence, or Floy. And I'm not going to read all of this out, but as he reaches his death, the narrator takes over, the old fashion death. Oh, thank God, all who see it, for that older fashion yet of immortality. And look upon us, angels of young children, with regards not quite estranged, when the swift river bears us to the ocean. I see I haven't had quite the same effect on you that Dickens did on his audiences. He noted, especially when he did a reading tour of Ireland, that this passage brought their house and dissolved them down into tears. And he said that although he'd seen such responses before in England, he'd never quite seen men in particular give themselves up so completely to sobbing as they did in Dublin and Belfast when he read this passage to them. And many years earlier, when this had first been published in instalment form, the distinguished lawyer and man of letters Francis Jeffrey had written to Charles Dickens to congratulate him on this incredibly moving scene. And he wrote, "I have so cried and sobbed over it last night, and again this morning." I like the idea that he's gone back to it to make himself cry again. You get a sense of this delicious, painful pleasure that he wants to have again in the morning. I don't know if any of you have done that. I've been guilty occasionally, I think. And felt my heart purified by these tears, and blessed and loved you for making me shed them. This is certainly a man of feeling, writing to another one. Perhaps he was thinking of those words. Maybe he read this page over again and thought about those words about young children being angels, not quite estranged, and about the swift river which bears us all to the ocean of death. Now, I don't know what your emotional or intellectual response is to this kind of writing. For several reasons, I think it's more likely to turn the stomach than dampen the eye of modern readers, and especially of those most cynical and dry of modern readers, the academics. The scene certainly seems overdone, even if we're going to be generous. The sentiment is heaped on with a shovel. It's not just a dying boy, it's this perfectly strange and innocent little boy breathing his last, reassuring all around him that he's happy, that he's fine, that he can see his mother, that he's going to a better place, facing his pain and the injustice of his short life being cut short with stoicism and heroism, with his beloved sister, her head on the pillow next to him, and so on and so on. It feels overdone, to say the least. And then also strange for a modern reader, what's this stuff about immortality? And suddenly God is there making everything all right, just at the moment of pain and loss. So it's not something, I think, that easily moves a 20th or 21st century reader. Now, when thinking unsympathetically about Dickens and his sentimentality, we will immediately remember that quip of Oscar Wilde's. Wilde famously said that you would have to have a heart of stone to read The Death of Little Nell without laughing. And we can all laugh along with Oscar about the way that he brought Dickens down with that comment made about 50 years, it should be said, after the book was published. And yet, it would be hard to think of a more sentimental writer than Oscar Wilde. So we should not laugh too hard at Dickens without remembering that. Indeed, I'd say there is no more sentimental book in the English language than The Happy Prince and Other Tales, published in 1888, replete with sentimental religious imagery, dead children, dead animals. And I say this with feeling and with personal experience. I cannot get through more than a couple of pages of these stories without starting to well up. And if I'm reading them out loud, then that makes the tears all the more unavoidable, as I'm embarrassed again in front of my children, getting choked up and welling up inexplicably to them as I read this stuff about beautiful innocent boys and gardens and flowers and dead birds going to heaven and so forth. So, thanks to Oscar Wilde, I found myself in the embarrassing position of weeping over a dead bird. And at such moments, it is hard to believe in Oscar Wilde, the hard-headed anti-sentimentalist. So I think it's important that we should remember that before we characterize too quickly who was sentimental and who was not. In fact, more generally, I've found that several critics of sentimentality in the 19th century have, like Wilde, themselves been purveyors of quite sentimental literature. And I think it may be that they, for themselves, believe that they can draw a distinction between unhealthy sentiment and deep pathos. Probably Dickens would have felt he was able to make that distinction too. And again, that might be something we want to think about when asking ourselves, what, if anything, is wrong with crying over emotional and sentimental stories? Well, in a different comment that Oscar Wilde made, we can find one answer to what is wrong, or might be wrong with it. In De Profundis, Oscar Wilde defined a sentimentalist as somebody who wants to have the luxury of an emotional reaction without paying for it. So that's one idea, that when crying over a dead child, a fictional dead child, somebody else's dead child, we're wanting to have that painful pleasure of weeping and emotion without having paid for it with experience. But this is one place where historical perspective is helpful, because of course, for Victorians, they very likely had already paid for it with experience. The infant mortality rate was 50 times greater than it is now. About a quarter of all deaths recorded were deaths of infants under the age of 1. For For comparison, that figure now would be less than half of 1%. So, of course, most people had already experienced or feared that they would soon experience the loss of a young child, a sibling or a son or daughter. And many indeed wrote to Dickens directly connecting his narration of death scenes with their own real-life loss and bereavement, and thanked him, as Francis Jeffrey had, for the purifying or consoling experience they had derived from reading his works. And the influence could go the other way too. When the Dean of Carlisle, Archibald Tate, and his wife Catherine lost 5 young daughters in the space of a month to scarlet fever around Easter 1856, they both wrote incredibly poignant accounts of their loss and their bereavement, which, especially in the case of Catherine, include poignant death scenes which mirror very closely the Dickensian formula. The religious deathbed, the great pathos, the heroism of the child in the face of this, and the religious hope in the face of all this pain that the parents are holding out. So this is the key idea, I think, that there's a flowing backward and forward between literary experience and lived experience. As I said today, we live now in an age of great sensibility. And there are, as in the Victorian period, as there are now, mixed reactions to that sentimentality and to that sensibility. And I think Oscar Wilde's complaint that people are trying to have the emotion without paying for it, that it's somehow unearned or inauthentic, is still very much with us. So if we think back to, or those of us old enough, think back to 1997 and the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. This is an image showing some of the people mourning on the occasion of her funeral. One of the frequent complaints about this response was that this was a kind of unearned emotional grief. These people didn't know Diana. I often heard people say, what are they crying about? They never met her. What does she mean to them? It's a very literal-minded complaint. It's also a complaint that people make about some reality television. I often speak about this example when I can because I so much enjoyed watching it. Brian Blessed, when he appeared on the reality genealogy show, Who Do You Think You Are? And found out moving things about his ancestors. And what was so wonderful about Brian Blessed's performance was that when he is in that final, almost compulsory, very emotional moment, facing at the end of the program the grave of his ancestor, he fights and fights against the tears. He even says, I've never cried before in my life, not even as a baby. Which is such a wonderful line. He stands there struggling and struggling, but then the tears come, and to his astonishment, and we there sit on our sofas, weeping over him, almost not weeping. And it's a brilliant, and you might say quite a Victorian performance, combining the repression and restraint with the leaking out of sentiment. But again, there are critics of this sort of a programme who would say, he never met his ancestor. I mean, critics do say this sort of thing. TV critics. These people never met their ancestors. What are they doing? They're weeping over a complete stranger, weeping over the death of a stranger. What could be more silly and more sentimental? Well, having studied many centuries of emotion and tears, I certainly find this a very strange objection. Who would weep over the death of strangers? Certainly not a Victorian objection, whether talking about fiction or real life. I feel like I want to ask in response, who would not weep over the death of a stranger? Who would not feel some shared humanity? Who would be so literal-minded as to say, I'm not going to cry over that, it's a made-up story. Or I'm not going to cry over that person, I never met them. So as a historian of emotions, I'm always trying to, I suppose, have it both ways. On the one hand, to say the emotional lives we live now are very different from the emotional lives of the past. The culture that we are immersed in, the beliefs that we have about ourselves. And indeed, I hope I've shown there's some truth in that. It's hard for us to get inside the mind of a reader of Paul Dombey dying and feel the great Christian pathos of that scene. But on the other hand, I want to say there's something that we have in common. We can have some understanding of what Francis Jeffrey thought, and he would be able to have some understanding perhaps of what Brian Blessed thought. So I'm wanting at the same time to point to the strangeness and the similarity. And to end with the idea of similarity, we might think of some Dickensian moments in our own very recent history. For example, when that image of the drowned 3-year-old Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, washed up on the shores of modern Europe like some distant Victorian waif, reduced many people to tears last year. Is Island Kurdi a kind of Paul Dombey for our times? And people asked, as we might ask today, is it right that political debates should be influenced by powerful emotional images reducing people to tears? Some people were bold enough in the press to say, what difference does this make? I've seen a picture of a dead toddler. Why should that change my attitude to this? And it's a brave person who would say that, I think. But I'll end with an image of, I think, my favourite and most impressive bit of Dickensian pathos of recent times, which is President Barack Obama. And it's perhaps not surprising that we should find the most Victorian emotional expressions happening in a large Christian-dominated empire, today, the United States of America, in Dickens's day. Britain. Many of you saw this. It was in January when Obama was making a statement about gun control and his hopes for a change in legislation. And this was the moment when he recalled the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting and the very young children who had died. And he said, first graders. He wiped the tears away from his cheek. Every time I think of those kids, it makes me mad. And anger is, in fact, my next research project, so I'll be able to use this example for that as well. I think Charles Dickens would have approved that sense of intense morality combined with this very controlled display of feeling. Here is a man of feeling for the 21st century. And ending there with Barack Obama and Charles Dickens is a way to emphasize a more general point that I want to make, which I think not everyone agrees with, but it seems to me that there's no real difference between crying over a novel and crying over real life. And the reason I say that is to go back to something I said earlier, that there's this constant back and forth between lived experience and literary experience, between performance and experience, between culture and feeling. We identify with artistic representations and learn to feel through them. We learn to display our emotions. We learn to understand our emotions. We're not born understanding our emotions. And it was because of these ideas that I had about the education of feeling that I chose a particular quote as the epigraph for my whole book. There's a poem written in Middle English. It's written in the voice of the Virgin Mary, talking about the passion and suffering of her son. And it has this refrain, "Therefore to weep, come learn at me." And I think that's a great motto to summarize the way that we learn our emotions through cultural products, whether they be religious poems, images in the news, or reality television programs. And hopefully what I've suggested with this flavor of my own research is that we can even expand and reflect upon our emotional repertoires by studying Victorian literature and history as well. Thank you.